Good afternoon, everybody. This is the second edition of the Top Performance Strength Podcast. This is Kip Steingart, and I'm joined by Bill Miller and Declan Peterson. What's going on, guys?
How you doing?
Hey, Kip.
Hey, fellas. So again, we're back with the second edition of the Top Performance Strength Podcast, and today's topic of conversation is going to be how to construct a warm-up, right? So let's get right into it, and let's start discussing how to construct a warm-up, right? So the first question we like to ask is, Declan, you've been in the game for a while now between playing high school and college and pro ball. What do you do?
So for me, for a warm-up, I think all of it starts with understanding how my body feels, how I've slept, how I've recovered, and some areas that I know need extra attention. From there, usually I start with soft and deep tissue work, so using lacrosse balls, golf balls, foam rolling. So that's usually where I start with that, and then I start to get into some of my mobility work, because I'm definitely more of a tight type of individual. So I go through a lot of mobility drills, and then from there I start into my dynamic warm-up usually, and it depends upon the day, whether that's usually some type of skipping variation, something like that, and then I'll get into my skill work or my sprinting, and then leading into my lifting.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. The first thing that you touched on right there is super important, just understanding how your body feels and how you have recovered from previous training sessions or previous games, whatever that is. Knowing how you feel, knowing how your body is going to function that day will tell a lot about what you should be doing in that training session. So if you walk into the gym and you're absolutely wiped, gassed from previous practices or training sessions, what have you, it's important to relay that information to your coach and understand that so you know what to tinker with in your program's intensity that day.
Yeah, exactly, right? And we just, again, we started fall ball last week with a 16, 17U high school team. And while everything we're doing as a part of our warm-up is very general right now, like the ultimate goal is to kind of teach them the sequencing of everything, right? We start with our foam rolling drills. We'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes on that, just working on soft tissue, whether it's with the foam rollers or the lacrosse ball and some key areas that we need to address. And then we're going to get into our PRI-based positional breathing drills to work on a couple of resets as far as repositioning our pelvis and our rib cage, and then we're going to get into anywhere from say 8 to 10 mobility as well as activation drills to ensure that we're opening up and we're able to access full joint mobility from a joint by joint perspective. And then we like to get into more of our dynamic-based movements, like Declan had said. You're going to get into your skipping series. It could be lateral shuffles, karaoke, back pedal, things of that nature. We're kind of working on getting a little bit of blood flow along with getting some full body compound movements in. And this is all going to be accomplished in, say, anywhere from a 20 to 30 minute period. Some guys maybe a little bit longer, maybe a little bit less, depending on your individual body type. And just in terms of kind of what your personal preferences too plays a bit of a role in that, and kind of what the goal is for the day.
Yeah, 100%. And I think something that's a common issue with a lot of athletes we see is we just see kids that walk right in and go right into the weightlifting stuff. They go right in and they're not doing anything to activate their body, activate anything. And I think it's really important to understand that warming up is not just boring stuff that you're supposed to do because coach tells you. It's important because it's going to make every rep of your workout that day better. Now, instead of half-hearted reps that are only getting a little bit of adaptation, every single rep is going to produce adaptations that we want to see with athletes. That's how you make results. It's not just about doing the reps that are on the sheet. It's about doing the reps very well. It starts with the warm-up.
Yeah, exactly, right? We talk a lot about building context from everything we do that has, of course, there's a specific role and a specific purpose to it. So, we talk about doing something like, a half kneeling hip flexor stretch. What are we teaching with that? Well, you're not only teaching a good position as far as how to establish a good half kneeling position, but you're also working on of course, hip separation from the front side and the back side, but you're also working on good tissue length through the hip flexors, which we know is critical for improving sprinting speed and just power output in general, right? So, what's going to happen if somebody doesn't have good hip flexor extensibility is, right, the body is going to compensate. We're going to find joint range of motion somewhere else, typically at the joint above or below, and that could be the lower back, typically the lower back as opposed to the knees as well. So we're just kind of increasing that risk of injury. So everything is about context, right? We were doing a simple glute bridge exercise with the guys in the warm up yesterday, and I'm sure, like, well, a lot of guys may think it's a simple exercise or it's silly, whatever it may be, but it's teaching them again how to move independently through their hips as opposed to their lower back. And while it's a basic ground-based movement, right, and there's a lot to be said about progression from moving to ground-based to kind of stationary moving exercises, but you want to teach them again how to move effectively through their hips independent of their lower back, and that's going to play a role in essentially so many of the things we do from a strength and a power perspective in the gym.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Like, there's so many opportunities in the warm-up to work on great movement patterns. Yeah. And if you can do that, obviously, on a daily basis, think about all the, the progress that you're going to make over the course of a month. And I think that's really important to understand. But kind of moving into more of a baseball perspective, like warming up to throw, like that's a huge, huge topic. And Declan, obviously, you play professional baseball. You're still in it right now. Like, what are some things that you would do going into throwing, and what are things that you prioritize, and any stories that you might have about guys who are warming up during a baseball season that you see?
Yeah, so for me, I think one of the biggest keys, it's kind of a cliche, but it's warm up to throw, don't throw to warm up. A lot of guys always are wondering, like, how are you getting to 90, 120 feet so quickly? I'm like, well, I'm already ready and warmed up and ready to go. I don't need 20 throws at 30, 40, 50 feet, wasting reps, wasting bullets, putting more stress on my arm when I could just do a simple, an extra 5 minutes of a warm-up and be able to have less throws and throw further than these other people. One of the big things I like also is J-bands, going through a J-band series, just to activate a lot of the muscles in my upper back in particular, and just to get a big dump of blood flow to that area before I throw. I think some of the mistakes though that I see is, like I talked about, guys just throwing at like 30, 40 feet. I don't know why guys continually do that. Guys not throwing before games and then wondering why their arms hurt. I don't know why that is. I think part of that is because their arm hurts in the first place, so they want to throw the least amount possible, which I totally understand. I'm the same way too, but I know that especially long toss for someone like myself is something that helps keep my arm strong, especially when I'm playing multiple positions, but playing majority of my time at second base. A lot of times my arm path gets a little funky because it's kind of strange to whip balls over from 60, 70 feet away on a routine grounder over to the first baseman as hard as you can. So if I ever need to go out to right or left and launch one, and I haven't done that for maybe a week or two, it's not a recipe for success. So making sure I keep my arm slot and my arm strength up by playing long toss has been a huge key. But a lot of guys kind of neglect that and try to get the least amount of throw as possible, but I think partially because their arm does hurt, but I think a lot of that stems from them not getting a proper warm-up, so it's just like accumulated stress. And like what Kip talked about is like trying to find that range of motion when they're not accessing that before they even start throwing, and they start, a lot of times they find that pain in the shoulder or the elbow or forearm, and it's just it spirals out of control. Next thing you know, somebody's hurt, and then they never want to throw. And people kind of go to all different types of means to try to correct that. And another huge mistake that I've seen in pro ball, which I was really surprised, was guys that still run poles and do long distance running, which, I don't want to get on too big of a tangent for, but it's probably not the most optimal way to train and recover and get blood flow. But hey, at the end of the day, it's your career.
Yeah, exactly. And you touched on a lot of good points there, but a couple that I'd like to address more in detail, right? I think the ultimate goal with going through a proper warm-up prior to picking up a baseball is to optimize range of motion, right? And it's always going to come back to, like, what does our assessment say, and what is your individual body type? Are you a loose guy? Are you a stiff guy? Are you kind of a middle of the road guy? And where do we go from there as far as constructing your individual warm-up? So somebody like yourself, you'd say you're probably a little bit more stiff, right?
Yeah, very tight.
You're going to spend a little bit more time in terms of optimizing your range of motion, and we know some of the limitations you have specifically, where someone like Dr. Fu does a great job addressing your repositioning drills, and then we come in and we give you the specific mobility drills that you incorporate as a part of your warm up. So if you want to kind of give an example as far as like what your limitations are and how you go about addressing those with specific drills that you might do to ensure that, you know, you're able to access full joint range of motion before you pick up a baseball.
Yeah, I'll talk about some of the things I do, like when I'm on the field and I'm not in the gym. I think one big thing is definitely the tissue quality in my pec, in particular, just because that becomes a big decelerator as my arm gets tired throughout a season. And a lot of that has to do with tightness in my lat, and it kind of just like spreads from there. So I like using a lacrosse ball, in particular, all throughout my lat, rolling that area out, and then using an AccuMobility ball for my pec, so I can get into pec minor and go through some range of motion type of stretching in those two areas, so lat and pec in particular, and then as well as all throughout my upper, middle, and lower traps. Those areas get extremely tight, so making sure to do a lot of work on those areas. And then also right around biceps tendon, front of the shoulder and the bicep, just to roll out gently with a lacrosse ball in that area before I do my band work. I've noticed really prepares my tissue and my arm before I start throwing in particular.
Okay. Yeah. So
and I think there are definitely some real common mistakes. Obviously, Declan, you touched on running a ton of pulls and stuff like that before you throw. I think everybody can agree here that that's not a great route for making sure you're ready to throw a baseball well.
No.
But, one of the most common mistakes that I see with a lot of high school kids is, they get on the J-band tree and they just start whipping their arm around like extremely fast, and that's not the goal of any of this stuff. What we're trying to do is create good movement patterns, right? Create patterns through a full range of motion where you're actually controlling the scap. Wherever the hand goes, the scap is driving that movement, and you really start to lose that when you rush through your band exercises. So I typically try to tell guys to take more of a 2 to 3 count approach with every single rep, where they actually have to focus on what they're doing as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the most common mistakes I see. I see high school kids when it comes to the warm up, and even at the college level, and it just kind of drives me nuts and makes me want to bang my head into a wall, because I constantly see these issues, right, and I'm constantly addressing and correcting these issues with the high school guys that we work with, right, because we can make a direct impact on them. But we see it all the time out at games. Just kids are doing endless J-band exercises with too much resistance, and again, doing it incorrectly, just haphazardly kind of going through the motion. And it's maybe the fact that they've never been coached on how to do these things properly, or they just have poor body awareness, or just don't know how to move with quality. Well, that's of course always going to come down to good coaching and instruction. So the first thing I would say with that is just we like to choose 2-3 top J-band exercises with very light resistance. And when I say light, I mean we're using the J-bands that are meant for like the 12 and under kids, because that's plenty enough resistance in terms of learning how to create an efficient overhead motion with something like a Y drill, or like a trap raise drill, where we're driving good motion on the rib cage, something like a T or a horizontal abduction, and then kind of getting into more of a functionally specific drill, like an external rotation where the arm is up at 90 degrees, and we're working on getting into that lay back position and developing good stability and activation in the back of the shoulder or the rotator cuff before they again pick up a ball. And we always have guys that prove market improvements in terms of just how they feel and how they move overall before they pick up a baseball.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Like, there's so many opportunities in a warm-up. With all the reps that we do in a warm-up on a daily basis, there's so many opportunities there to create better movement patterns and to really master those movement patterns. And if you're rushing through your band exercises, rushing through your warm-up, you're not getting better. And I do think the warm-up is a huge opportunity for that. But kind of moving on to the next page, so now we've talked about some of the mistakes that a lot of baseball players will make. Now, how can we take that next step and really individualize the warm-up? How can you make sure that your warm-up is really working for you?
Yeah. So this is where we talk about assessments, right? And we could do a whole nother podcast just on the topic of assessments, and kind of based off what we see in terms of Joint restrictions. Some of the most common, right, that we see specifically with baseball players are going to be shoulder flexion and elbow extension. So sticking with like the shoulder flexion example, right, we always look at overhead range of motion numerous overhead range of motion patterns, and we're kind of identifying how their shoulder blades are moving on their scap as they reach their arms overhead or through various movement patterns. That's going to give us a lot of insight in terms of like not only what they look like from a postural or positional standpoint, but how do they move, and is one of the questions we like to ask ourselves. But even more importantly is like how well do they move, right? Because everything always has to come back to quality. So typically we'll see a few different presentations with how their scaps are moving on the rib cage, and when they go into an overhead pattern, as well as when they lower down back to the starting position, because we're also looking at eccentric phase of motion or deceleration as well. So sticking with that back to wall shoulder flexion, typically what you're going to see is either somebody's going to be in like a military type posture where their shoulder blades are kind of stuck together, or we might see somebody where their shoulders are kind of more of a downwardly depressed position where they're kind of tucked in their back pockets, or you might see somebody whose shoulder blades as well as their shoulders more in anterior tilt or forward tilt. And we know all of these things are going to affect what happens, not only at the shoulder and the elbow joint, but ultimately how they release the baseball. So knowing these things on an individual basis is going to play a huge role in terms of how we offer individual coaching and cueing to the athlete, right?
Yeah, 100%. And Declan had talked a little earlier about how he's very tight in certain places. So obviously you want to address mobility with those certain spots. But with a lot of the kids that we see, we're looking at very loose movers, very hypermobile athletes.
Yeah.
So rather than trying to get into deeper and deeper ranges of motion with them, a good approach could be simple activation drills, simple joint stability type exercises included in the warm-up to help promote that joint stability that you really want, because those hypermobile athletes don't need more range of motion, they
Right.
need more control over those joints. That's what's really going to help them throw faster and continue to develop down the road as well. So understanding that not every body is ready to do the exact same mobility routine that Declan's doing, or maybe some of the older guys that we see that are a little bit stiffer, more robust in their overall musculature.
So coming back to kind of like working on individual body types and how to structure individual warm-ups, right? Let's look at like somebody who's hypermobile, somebody who's a little more loose jointed and has poor stability and poor control and just overall poor body awareness, right? They're not aware in terms of where their body is in space or how they should be moving at specific joints. So we kind of stick with that shoulder flexion example where we're teaching somebody how to do like a back to wall shoulder flexion, right? How a stiff mover does it compared to somebody how as a loose mover does it is going to be remarkably different. So it's going to be much more, I'd say it's going to be an easier path for the loose guy to get overhead. But at the same time, there's room for error in terms of how they're going to compensate. You may see similar compensation patterns as a stiff guy. You may see different compensation patterns as a stiff guy. And more than likely, you are going to see different compensation patterns. But right, that just tells us what we need to do from an individual coaching standpoint. So for a loose guy, when they get overhead, like we said, they're not going to have any issue getting to that full overhead range of motion pattern. Where they commonly make their mistakes is they don't know how to create stiffness in their midsection, right? We talk about core stability and how to create proper core stability. Well, that means keeping your ribs kind of down, in and back, or more so connected to your pelvis, right? So we call that a canister position. We teach everybody a proper core positioning or canister position, as we like to call it too. So that just means keeping your rib cage down facing your pelvis, where your rib cage isn't flared up kind of toward the ceiling, because that's going to cause extension in the lower back, and that's going to cause your pelvis to dump forward, right? Which again, that's just kind of a recipe for numerous injuries down the road, and that's ultimately going to affect ball release too. With athletes like that, because they have such poor body awareness, right, we might have to put them like on their back right, in kind of like a 3-month position where their hips and knees are flexed to 90 degrees. We have them do an overhead reaching pattern, just like in a back to wall shoulder flexion, but we're teaching them good core stiffness, and then eventually we can kind of get them up on their feet and translate that to a better pattern eventually, until they develop that good stiffness, right, and that kind of body awareness.
Yeah, most definitely. So now, I guess to wrap it all up,
Yeah.
how do we put it all together? What would be a good example of a warm up for your average 15-year-old kid? I mean, we've been doing it every night with these 15 and 16-year-old kids. So obviously, first thing that kid's going to do is they're going to grab the foam roller every single night, and you could talk about that as well, Kip.
Yeah. So Declan did a pretty good job as kind of demonstrating what his kind of warm up routine looks like. But like I said, we'll do about, I don't know, probably 5 to 6 drills max. So this way we're spending about 5 to 7 minutes total on some foam rolling. Typically, like the common areas that are overactive that we're going to see are going to be like your calves, your hip flexors, your quads, hip rotators, lats, pecs, and the back of the shoulder. So we've been addressing those 6 areas every night. And then from there, we're going to get into our ground-based mobility and activation drills, which could be, again, anywhere from about 8 to 10 drills. So we'll go with a half kneeling hip flexor stretch. We'll get into a glute bridge, which again is teaching them good context for a lot of things we're going to do from a strength and a power perspective. We'll get into a 90-90 floor slide. We'll get into it's either a side-lying T-spine opener or a side-lying windmill. Again, all these variations are, again, always comes back to like the individual and what their individual needs are based off whether you're a loose or a stiff guy. We like to get into a downward dog then, because that teaches a lot of good things in terms of just opening up the backside, and teaching them how to reach is going to be pivotal for them to learn how to create proper rib or scapular motion on the rib cage. Then we like to get them standing with the back to wall shoulder flexion if we can, and then a forearm wall slide, just to kind of reinforce that rib cage positioning and motion. And then we'll get into various compound movements like a squat pattern, right, which we're going to be doing on our training days. So that's going to give them good context for how to squat the right way. And then a reverse lunge pattern is a pretty simple kind of split stance position we could put them into to teach them how to be successful. And then we're working more of a lateral split squat, so we're teaching them side to side motion, and then we're going to go with like a single leg RDL or bowler squat to teach them good single leg stability and balance. And then from there, we're going to get into our skipping series, right, which is anywhere from probably 3 to 5 drills, teaching them good sprinting technique and mechanics with our A marches. We go slow, and then we like to go fast, and then we'll get into our A skips, and then depending on the day, that might be a little more extensive. If we're working lateral multi-directional work, we might incorporate some lateral based skips or shuffles or karaoke into the mix. And then from there, we'll get into kind of our power work, which is a good opportunity just in terms of getting post-activation potentiation. So if you want to kind of elaborate on that in a second, we can too. So with that, we'll incorporate some snap down drills to teach them how to decelerate and absorb force. We might do some hurdle hops with a stick, again, just to reinforce good force absorption. And then if it's an upper body focused day like it was yesterday, we might work on, say, some overhead med ball stomps before we kind of get into our specific skill work. And that's kind of another topic kind of topic to expand upon too is you can get individualized with some of these drills too, especially when it comes to med ball throws, in terms of just addressing patterning and some kind of mechanical issues that we see with respect to throwing. So that's where we can get even a little more specific with our throwing too. With our warm-ups. And then typically after that time period, some guys, if they like to do J bands, then we'll let them do 2 to 3 exercises again, maybe 6 to 8 reps, and then we're good to go as far as what we need to do from a skill perspective.
Yeah, and with that post-activation potentiation idea, that potentiating warm-up, that is really crucial as well. And you got to remember, when we're weightlifting, when we're throwing, it's a very high effort movement. And we want to make sure that that central nervous system is very highly activated and ready to put out as much force as we need it to get the job done, whether it's swinging, throwing, or weight training. But yeah, like Kip had said, on an upper body day, a medicine ball chest pass or slam could work really well. You don't need much more than 2 sets of 5 reps. That's all you would need. And on a lower body day, I think a jump or even a short sprint works very well for activating the lower body a little bit. And it doesn't have to be much. It should not be fatiguing. This is the most important thing. We're working on activation, not fatiguing, just getting you ready to go in that workout. So yeah, I think, everything that Kip had just talked about, each exercise, you probably don't need to spend more than 30 seconds on an exercise. If you're spending much more than that, you might be wasting time a little bit. You might be screwing around with your buddies. It's something that we've seen. Our warm-up went from about 35 minutes down to 25 minutes, and now it's under 20 minutes every night. Mm-hmm. And it's because it's bang, 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 20, 30 seconds each exercise, go to the next one. It's all you really need. If you get on that type of a routine, this long warm-up that seems so intimidating is really not all that intimidating at all. It's getting everything that you need done, and these kids go on and have a great session.
Yeah, exactly. So I couldn't have said it better myself, right? And now to kind of wrap this up, we can touch a little bit on like how to build a post-throwing routine or even a post-workout routine, right? Because there's so many commonalities between not only what are we going to do from a warm-up standpoint in the weight room to what you're going to do out at the field before you practice or before you play a game. There's commonalities, right? You may tinker with a few things here and there as far as like, again, taking your J-bands out before you pick up a ball and throw it at practice or a game. But in terms of what you're going to be doing from a post-workout standpoint or post-throwing or post-game, post-practice, whatever it may be, again, it's going to be remarkably the same. Again, the only difference is like, what is your individual body type? Again, coming back to like whether you're a stiff guy, well, you need to work on improving range of motion. If you're a loose guy, well, you need to work on rebuilding some of the stability that you may have lost. Or if you're, like I said, a stiff guy, improve the range of motion that you lost, whether if that's like with shoulder flexion range of motion or if that's elbow extension range of motion. And then we can get into obviously some of the mistakes that we commonly see. Pull running without question is one of the biggest mistakes that we see. Adding fatigue to an athlete that's already in a fatigue state is just absolutely mind-boggling to me how we still continue to see things like that.
Don't do it.
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about performance enhancement, like we can't talk enough about expediting the recovery process. It's what you do immediately after you're performing in a practice or you're out competing in a game is going to be exponentially important to your bounce back ability so you can come back the following day fresh and prepared and ready to go for whatever the task is. All right, guys, that's going to wrap up this episode of Top Performance Strength Podcast. If you like it, please go ahead and share it on Instagram. If there's any topics of conversation you wanted us to discuss, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll get that going for you sometime in the future.